I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm with a good friend of mine, Professor Ben Steiner. Ben has written a lot to date on Jewish marriage contract and the Ketubah. Did a lot of really wonderful work in the 20th century on Professor Saul Lieberman and this interesting mid-century moment in conservative Judaism. But your dissertation takes you back to the 19th century. And for this Why's That segment, I thought it very prudent to speak with you about how material culture, how extra-textual or even non-textual materials help teach us something brand new about that formative 19th century.
So my dissertation, I guess, is sort of a hybrid model because the Ketubah is both an object of material culture, but it's also a text. And I analyze it in both ways. So, you can learn something from the fact that in some places the Ketubah was on vellum, on parchment. You can look at Ketubot and realize how important they were in certain communities or not. But the major thrust of my dissertation is to look at the translation of the Ketubah into English. And I contextualize that in a number of case studies. And each one of them sort of unpacks a period of time and a place in America very different from our own. So the Lieberman Clause, as you mentioned, is one final chapter, but the bulk of the dissertation really focuses on the 19th century, and there's a reason for that. Unlike today, when you can go on the internet and find any Ketubah that you want, back then, local translation was really key to the success of the Ketubah. You didn't have networks of rabbis corresponding with each other about this. They each made their own translation. And in the process, they left clues for us to study American Jewish history.
So what kind of questions, based on this new source base, what type of questions are you able to ask that have been queried by earlier historians? What answers, what vistas are you able to open up because of those questions?
So one major issue is the relationship between Jewish law and secular law. One thing I realized, or what I found out over the course of my research, is that in certain places in America, the Ketubah was actually understood as a functional secular contract. It was recorded in the public record, and it was recognized as such. It was defended in the courts, which is something that really nobody has explored before. Other aspects that I uncovered have been talked about, but it's really just another lens onto it. So, for example, we learned about the lived experience of Jewish women from the types of translations that were created. We learn and how they were used. We learn about how even though Ketubahs are not decorated documents in America so much, they might look really schlumpy, so they've been ignored. They actually tell us an immense amount of information about Jewish social history. And so it's really the relationship between Jews and their Gentile neighbors. It's the lived experience of Jewish women, and it's the relationship between secular and religious law.
How are all those three explicated? What do Ketubot teach us about Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors, for instance?
So in California, for example, my second chapter deals with California. And there, in the early days of the California gold rush, you have Jews pouring into California in disproportionate numbers, and they're using their Ketubahs in new ways. So some of them are recording their Ketubahs in the public record, and San Francisco burned in 1908, so you have fewer records from there. But if you go to Sacramento, you go to other places of Jewish settlements, you find literal translations of the Ketubah recorded in the public record. And that was because they were understood to be post-nuptial contracts, as other people would have signed in different formats, not the Ketubah, but still a post-nuptial contract. So that is the beginning of the story in California. But what happens in the coming decades is that it becomes really a mechanism of Jews trying to introduce Judaism to their Gentile neighbors. Gentiles were flocking to Jewish weddings because they wanted to see what Mosaic marriage looked like, right? It's sort of in this place where everything is new, where everything is uncertain. People want some sort of anchor. They want to know about something historical, about something quote unquote authentic that they can perceive and appreciate. And the Jews really trumpet the Ketubah in that respect. So even though
it was a way to telegraph what it was all about.
Right. So you have a tremendous number of translations that are pouring out of a relatively small community. Every single rabbi in California in the first decades of statehood created at least one translation of the Ketubah. And they used them, and they were effective. And we have sources which show this. The rabbis are really reading out these translations proudly before everyone who's in attendance, trying to show how Jews are integrated into American society, and yet how they also harbor these very authentic ancient customs.
Why would one rabbi not be satisfied with another's translation?
So there, I think it has a lot to do with the local nature of Jewish life in America. Obviously, maybe these rabbis are catering to synagogues that are just blocks apart. But I think the mentality back then was not, oh, how can I find a pre-existing template for a ketubah? Rather, it was, oh, how can I use the ketubah as a means of serving a particular aim? So for Reform rabbis, you have a lot of ketubahs that really don't look like a traditional ketubah at all. They might be in English or German. They really are just intended to be a placeholder that also conveys Jewish social integration. You have Orthodox rabbis that have more literal translations, and you have, but they're all doing their own thing. They're not part of a dialogue on, or they're not looking for a reservoir from which to find translations of the Ketubah. They're creating it for themselves because that's what they saw as what was necessary at the time.
Would a rabbi produce several different translations depending on, in this case, only his community? Would he look to translate it in one way for one couple, another way for a different one?
Usually that was not the case, but you did have situations where a rabbi might have a literal translation to be read at the wedding ceremony, but then they have a non-literal translation that they give to the couple to sort of understand more what the ketubah was about, or vice versa. So it was all about trying to get Jews to come to terms with their Judaism and to come to terms with their Gentile neighbors. And the ketubah becomes a very convenient mechanism for facilitating that.
What were you able to learn about the women's experience in the 19th century because of this material?
So I'll focus on one chapter. I have a chapter on South Carolina and Georgia. And there, disproportionately, unlike really anywhere else in America, you have Jews recording ketubahs in the public record and being enforced in the courts. And it was especially important for 19th century Southern Jewish women because in the South at that time, life was short, right? Most women could expect to lose their husbands within a decade after getting married. And so it created a great imperative for safeguarding the woman's financial assets after her husband died. So under South Carolina law, as a baseline, women could not own property during the course of their marriage. It was part of the coverture provisions that came from the common law from England. And so Jews used ketubahs in the public record to get around secular laws that otherwise would have denied women the ability to inherit property in the way that they wanted to. So yes, the ketubah was written by a man. All these translations were written by men. I have not encountered a single translation of the ketubah from the 19th century that wasn't written by a man. At the same time, it's being used in ways that are very much helping women navigate a difficult social terrain, difficult economic terrain at the time.
So their male agency to support a women's population specifically.
I wouldn't say that it was, a feminist gesture. This was a way of making the economics of marriage work in antebellum Southern society. So yes, it does shed light on the experience of Jewish women, but I wouldn't say that it sheds light on a progressive impulse from men to try and, get women the property that they felt they needed. This was a matter of how do we as a society function properly when women under secular law cannot own property during their marriage.
So what was an alternate document outside of the Jewish space which accomplished much of the same?
So non-Jews in much smaller numbers proportionally recorded quote-unquote marriage settlements in the public record. So if a woman can't hold property during her marriage, a marriage settlement dictates sort of other ways in which women can hold property. Usually the property is put in trust for the woman among designated trustees. And those trustees hold her property in marriage during the course of the marriage. And after it ends, she gets the property back. So non-Jews are doing this. Maybe 2% of them are doing this. Jews are doing this. Perhaps 20 or 25% of them are recording these types of documents in the public record. So there's this great disparity that I haven't fully parsed out. I don't know exactly why it happened, but all I can think to myself is that the ketubah had something to do with it because they're recording ketubahs in the public record.
Right, so it's this great connecting device which almost accidentally brings a disproportionate number of Jews into this legal arena.
I also talk about England. And I think that's sort of the last part that I'll mention, which is that the most common translation used in America in the 20th century actually came from England. And others have written about how there was a cultural interchange between America and England. Adam Mendelsohn has written extensively to this. So my dissertation really shows that extends well into the 20th century, as you have Jews who are using this translation that had once been composed in England by the British chief rabbi, and subsequently spreads really throughout the English-speaking world. And that's really a moment where you say, no, it's not a local translation phenomenon that we had before in the 19th century. This is where translations are becoming national and even global. And it's all part of a nationalization and globalization of the Jewish community more broadly at that time.
Right, and all part of a text that for too often historians took for granted, even though they were in the archives all along.
Exactly.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.